So welcome everybody to the latest installation of Future of Sustainability, looking back to look forward. I'm really pleased to be here today with Joy. We are going to be looking at how the original trajectories that we published over 15 months ago, how have they evolved? What are we seeing? What's changing? Just before we do that though, I'll ask Joy to introduce herself. Joy.
Yeah, so I've been doing features here at Forum for, well, a very long time, almost 15 years. And in that time, sort of, seen a lot of what's interesting is so many dynamics have really sort of been building, and this sort of trajectory has really been drawing on that 15 years of sort of sensing and sense making, and then that's continued to what we had in the pandemic, where literally all the dials started like spinning almost, and so yeah, I guess. But for me, it's really interesting, sort of almost like reflection point now, as we sort of we're not out of the woods yet with the pandemic, but we're definitely at a very different place than we were 15 months ago.
Great. And so 15 months ago, for those of you that were paying attention, we launched our Future of Sustainability report. This year we're going for more of a serialized content, which is why we're having this conversation. But the central plank of the report last year was an analysis of what are the different pathways emerging from the COVID crisis. So this is back in October of last year. It seemed that all sorts of different possibilities were unfolding, and Joy was the architect of those four trajectories. So just to remind you, back in October 2020, we thought there were at least four possible pathways that might unfold as we emerge from the crisis that impacted all of us very profoundly last year. And in no particular order, the first trajectory was what we were calling compete and retreat. So this was a pathway dominated by the emergence of nationalist dynamics, a pathway where the mindset was actually we must look after our own first, and where we saw the splintering of multilateralism, the splintering of international governance, the kind of arrival of perhaps bilateral trade agreements. So this is a very splintered nationalistic world where if as a nation state you have access to the resources that you need, then that was fine. But actually in this trajectory, we didn't have the international governance that would allow us to respond as a global society to some of the big challenges that we faced. So that was compete and retreat. And as you'll hear, as I describe all four are still playing through, but perhaps they've dialed up and dialed down in different ways, and we'll come on to Joy and ask her about that in a moment. So compete and retreat, mindset, there's not enough to go around, we must look after our own. We then had discipline, which was a real sprint to get back to the economic model that we had pre-pandemic. We're still seeing international governance, but the mindset here is that we need to look at the health protection of nation states above privacy concerns, and the very much focus here is on efficiency. So in this trajectory, we see ramped up use of AI, ramped up use of technology. We see the return to the economic model that we had before, complete digitalization of global supply chains. And it's a world where government is very strong. Government control over societies is very strong. The light side of this trajectory is that because efficiency is so high in the mindset, we see the scaling of circular economy. So from a sustainability point of view, there are some light sides to this trajectory, but it's a hyper-efficient, very disciplined world, and issues around, say, the social dimension of radically decarbonising global supply chains aren't really on the agenda. So that's discipline. We then had transform, which, as you may remember, was the trajectory that we felt we should pay the most attention to, because it was in this trajectory that we see the flashes of inspiration at the niche of our world today. So different economic models, nature-based solutions, social justice really fusing with the climate agenda to create really compelling propositions for climate justice. This is the trajectory where planetary health equals human health, and where we try very hard not to go back to where we were before, which was a world that we weren't solving for the root challenges of structural inequality, structural racism, the climate emergency, but instead we use the huge flux caused in the system around us by COVID to actually create something better, to rewire our systems such that we broaden out the goals, for example, of the economic system, such that the economic system is there to serve society, is there to ensure we operate within planetary boundaries. So this is a world that we do see the realization of the ambition of the Sustainable Development Goals. And as with the other two, back in October last year, there were signs that this world could be the one that may emerge. We then had the fourth trajectory, which I think Joy will pick up this narrative, which at the time there was a big discussion internally. I don't remember, Joy. We were saying, is this actually a trajectory, or is this the drumbeat of the other three? Because this trajectory is a pathway where we just lurch from one crisis to another. There is no new normal. We have to be super adaptive, super flexible in this world. It's a world that's very hard to predict. It's a world where you envisage those connections between global society to solve some of our grand challenges much, much harder. But if you have an entrepreneurial mindset, if you're really adaptive and flexible, then actually this world is a little easier to navigate. So 4 trajectories that we talked about last year: compete and retreat, discipline, transform, unsettled. And back in October last year, all 4 were emerging. Our message was, let's concentrate on transform, because the more attention we pay to the future we want, the more likely it is to happen. But Joy, what's happened? What are we seeing 15 months on?
Yeah, I guess, the point is that, that all 4 do remain in play, and there always are overlaps between them as well. But what has been really striking to me, definitely sort of doing the sensing and sense making over the last year, is how much that unsettlement is really dialed up. There's just been sort of event after event, and it's not just very used to now almost environmental shocks to massive that sort of in Canada, for example, they're having that extraordinary thing when they had the heat dome, the fire, now the floods. So places that that seem to be quite safe harbors from environmental effects were revealed as actually there's nowhere safe. But also actually within systems ourselves, almost like these cascading shocks started to appear from once the rebound from the pandemic. We didn't rebound back into the old system. We ran straight into kind of brittleness. So, for example, global shipping, there was a massive, there was mismatch of supply and demand. You had this cascading effect where people are now saying it's going to be, 2 years. Who knows when it's going to get back to normal, because you've got these snarls and mismatches that are not smoothing, but they're sort of multiplying and metastasizing, and it's affecting computer chips, it's affecting gas, it's affecting computer goods, Christmas goods, and it's also been you're getting this sort of almost like conversion effect, because particularly with the computer chips, there was not just shortages because people have put in their supplies at the wrong moment, or they've been a mismatch, but also there was a storm in Texas at the wrong moment, which meant that they had their power supply was down. There was a drought in Taiwan, where the world's biggest chip is, and that also, so you had this sort of convergence where the weather and all the other factors came together, and then you had the blockage of the Suez Canal, and that again demonstrated the fragility of these systems. So you've got almost like a hack here, a block canal there, a port closure, the wind doesn't blow for a while, and our systems are revealed as actually not able to cope with what these shouldn't be wild cards, but they sort of are. So we're kind of moving into this new era of sort of systemic fragility, where our systems that were supposed to work just in time and in smooth and predictable conditions have hit this sort of rolling condition. It's almost like moving we've been for a long time, we sailed down a river, smooth river, and now we've hit the white water. But that white water is not showing any signs of going away. We're going to be in it for some time now, and again, this point is sort of been striking me as a futurist, is that there's quite a large range of things that used to be considered quite small and manageable events that now cause disruption. So there's a potential oil spill off the coast of Yemen that could basically close another major shipping lane and throw that into disruption, plus cause a famine, plus cause a lot of cascading effects from that. Another hack from the wrong, there was a hack of the sort of JBS, the major meat packer in the US, and that took out a quarter of meat supply in the US overnight. So you've got these situations where just one small event can cause things to fall over.
So it's a bit like a house of cards then.
Yeah, and we kind of reached that point exactly where it's become really brittle. But looking forward for the decade, and you look at, you know, what actually, you know, we see on the horizon, we don't see signs of sort of shelter from this. It's quite the opposite, you know, because they're looking at so if you look at costs from extreme weather events, so this year it was about, I think, 40 billion, or last year, but by the end of 2030 it's forecast to be $213 billion, that is. So that's, I mean, at that level you start to disrupt, you know, the global financial system, basically. So there's something really important here about the trajectory that we've been on, and we still are in, is actually, you know, it is a fundamentally different world to what we were in before the pandemic, and we are starting to perhaps bump into limits, and you know, of many different kinds.
And so what you described there, so the brittleness of these systems, their fragility, the fact that a small perturbation in one system causes cascading impacts across multiple systems, that all speaks to, I think, for me, the real need to get serious about reimagining these systems, and that, you know, we've hit the limits of the way in which our food system works, you know, our health system, our energy system, which of all the system is probably the one that's transitioning the most quickly. But even there's a risk that decarbonisation trajectory might not work in a way that drives social equity. And I guess then what you've just described underlines this need for something we've been talking about at Forum for a few months now, which is we've got to get serious about really deeply transforming these systems. We can't rely on them to deliver our goods and services, to deliver as the things that we want. And I know at the time when we published Future of Sustainability, that's why, of course, recognizing that we need wholesale systems configuration, you know, I personally was, I'm sure we all were, drawn to that transform trajectory, because that offers a possibility of rewiring our systems, of doing things fundamentally different. And even if we have this sort of backdrop of unsettled, you know, and you only have to watch one newsreel cycle one day and see it the next day. And we're recording this conversation in early December 2021, where we're now, lo and behold, dealing with a new variant to COVID, which has disrupted very, very many things just over the last couple of days. So that unsettled drumbeat is definitely there. Turning then to transform, Joy, how have you seen that trajectory evolve over the last 15 months, if indeed you have?
Yeah, so it's an interesting one. I think what's interesting here is almost like the different levels at which also the trajectories are working out. Like the unsettled feels like very much almost like a very global level, and and also all the levels we're sort of having to deal with it in different ways. But transform has been interesting because I think there has been actually a lot of activity, but it's tended to be maybe at the sort of areas like city level, for example. There's been a lot of actual, you know, sort of attempts to build better to Amsterdam, you know, saying they're going to build back the donut city, which is like, and really taking the steps to do that, you know, really actually thinking, what does it mean to actually rethink the economic model and bring everyone on board with that. You've also had other cities, I mean, Berlin and Birmingham rethinking the car. I mean, London as well. I mean, and these are sort of, that's the other thing that's interesting is these, because these are serious attempts at change, they're also, you know, they're slightly polarizing. So we had like in London, like, you know, that even just bringing in massive cycle lanes has been like, because it's serious change, there's the transform has a amount of disruption within it as well. I think the other thing that's been interesting is that there is also an interesting, I think at the sort of level of law, so an ecocide law was drafted, and I think the one at very highest international, the ICC. So that's really interesting that at that level that is starting to come into. And I think, Sally, you've also mentioned attempts, other attempts at that sort of.
Yeah, I mean, I guess. So I would agree that if you think about our world as a set of interconnected and nested systems, you know, unsettled is at the moment a slice of DNA that's going through the whole lot. You can see it everywhere. I think with transform, it is definitely appearing at that macroeconomic level. You know, I've been really struck by a shift in narrative and a shift in mindset from people in finance in particular, some CEOs of businesses, some politicians, using the word rewiring, using the word transformation, and particularly rewiring in the context of the global economy, because unless our economy is rewired and does repattern to a different set of goals, there's absolutely no way we are going to be able to deal with, you know, adapting to our changing climate and enable the allocation of finance to those parts of the world that need it to invest rapidly in adaptation infrastructure, for example. So at that macroeconomic level, I see shifts in mindset, I see shifts in dialogue, and absolutely at a city level, you see it. And cities have always been this vibrant hotbed of innovation, and they just kind of get on with things, which is always, you know, really joyful to watch in some ways. And then you see certain corporates really pushing hard in this space, and then the whole understanding and application of nature-based solutions for me is super interesting. You know, how do we harness our ecosystem assets in a way that builds biodiversity, but also starts to allow us to adapt to a changing climate? But I think what's missing when you look at transform in terms of how it appears in all of these systems, there is dissonance, because on the one hand, you know, one organization, one big financial institution might be calling for rewiring of the economy, and then even the same person from the same organization or a different person from an equivalently large organization, you know, might just be making the case for, well, you know, if we just tweak here and adjust the rate return ratio here, and if we just adjust risk appetite here, then we can flex the current model. And so what I see in that transform trajectory is a real tussle between those that see we absolutely have to talk about deep transformation, understand the levers we can pull to affect that deep transformation, and no, we don't know exactly what that looks like, versus those that say, yes, we understand planetary health equals human health, and yes, we understand things need to change, but maybe not by much. You know, maybe we can just kind of keep dialing up, dialing down here. And so I think right now, 15 months on, there's still a lot to play for in transform, and I think we are making progress. But I'm also struck by, and you talked about it a moment ago, Joy, that sort of that system dynamic. So there's a real pull away from our existing systems to rewire them, repattern them, reimagine them to create systems that are capable of allowing people and planets to flourish and address these root causes of some of the big challenges. And the more vibrant and the more energy that goes behind that, then the other bit of the system that just wants to push it back to where it is already is kind of really digging in. And so I think the big difference from when we launched the trajectories is, yes, there's progress in transform, but there's more dissonance now, and the stakes are really high. And so you're seeing a lot of vested interest beginning to dig in.
Yeah, there's definitely a risk of shallow transition, I think. You can really sort of see that because that, you know, that is, you know, because it's the comfortable space that is sort of a bit more disciplined. We go, yeah, we can have it a bit light before, but just a bit of a tweak. But I think there's also the other sort of interesting thing, I think, is more actually in that transform and settle space is a sort of like, was it the people power angle actually? So we've just seen in India, like the farmers actually finally, you know, they forced the repeal of the laws that they've been, you know, pushing for a very long time. But also, you know, I mean, that sort of Fridays for Climate was disrupted by the pandemic, but that energy hasn't gone away. Those young people haven't gone away.
No.
And actually what's been striking is just reviewing this sort of like the sort of civil society report on actually protest movements over the last 15 months. Actually, the number of protest movements, despite all the lockdowns, has increased there have been more protests, more mobilizing that's happened, and most of it has actually been in support of democratic values. Partly because there has been this sort of perception that, like, oh, hang on a minute, we are in a bit of a dangerous place in many parts of the world. But there's a lot of energy at that people power level that's not going to go away. That is really interesting, I think.
I think that's right. Huge energy. I guess what troubles me there is that the right for that energy to bubble up and the ability to march on the streets is actually closing down in some parts of the world. And underlines for me, I think I always knew this, but I've really reflected on this more over the last few months, that we need democracy. Democracy is kind of the foundation of the transformation that we want to see. And how do we make that message clearer, and what do we do about that? Because in a way, you're right then into sort of the foothills of geopolitics. And for those people listening, yes, hearing that energy in the system hasn't gone away, and if anything, actually it's intensified. There's a sort of a generation defined by their demographic, then there are movements defined by their particular views and where they are in the system. But how do we ensure that those voices are heard when you've got this equal and opposite force of governments that are suppressing that voice?
No, I think, part of also being clear about what is happening, because the other thing that has happened on the flip side, as you say, is not just that we have autocracy, which has always been there, but what has really been happening also the last 15 months is sort of like what they're almost calling in this interesting article in Atlantic, autocracy Inc., which is the way that autocrats have been much more smart at supporting each other to stay in power. It's almost pushed to share techniques for suppression, and so, for example, Belarus is interesting. So you had there, there was a point when it looked like he was going to be toppled by protests, and then basically Putin sent in his special forces, his agents to share techniques, and Belarus is now, basically operating with impunity as a rogue state, and has suppressed protest movements there. And so part of it is also being clear that the autocracy itself is also moving and changing and trying, pushing for advantage, and it is clear that it does want to push its advantage. And those of us who do want to fight for democracy have to recognize this is an important fight, and what are we going to do about this? Because it's an area that technology is also, it's very double-edged. It can be that there's fascinating stuff happening with decentralized technology, which is really kind of empowering. But also in terms of surveillance, there's a huge amount now to empower, an autocrat. So
yeah. Okay, so that's the dark underbelly of the world in which we find ourselves, which are the silent maneuvers of those with huge power, which could undermine the very democracy upon which we all depend. So those dark forces, if you will, and they've always been there, like you say. In some ways they're a bit more exposed today because of the sort of hyper-connected world in which we find ourselves. So taking a step back then, 15 months on, we see unsettled kind of characterizing a lot of how we're experiencing the world around us. We do see signs of transform continuing to emerge, and equally we haven't talked about compete and retreat and discipline, but the same is true. You could point to different parts of the world and they are characterized by either compete and retreat and or discipline, or a fusion of the two. So all four still playing out, with unsettled kind of being the flavor of where we're playing out, but transform still being possible. So if we hold on to that transform trajectory still being possible, because it is still playing out, I see flashes of it every single day. What then, when we look back over the last 15 months, what could we learn? What does that tell us about how do we turbocharge transform? How do we ensure it doesn't get submerged by unsettled and submerged by dark political forces? What have we learned? And I suppose one, and this kind of moves us on to why we must still keep paying attention to it. And why it could emerge is, when we published Future of Sustainability, there wasn't a vaccine for COVID. And 15 months later, there are multiple vaccines. So we can move quickly when we really, really, really need to. And there's something in that for me about the speed and the scale and the profound nature of the change that is needed to make transform a reality, which gives me hope. But Joy, when you look back over the last 15 months, what do you see that might allow us to kind of, A, maintain that vision of transform, B, bring it into reality?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's almost looking back and looking forward, but there's something interesting around the speed with which, once the world realised that COVID was happening, like it was remarkable at the time when Leave was reported, like, oh, we can actually stop the global economy when we really have to. If the stakes are high enough, we can do it. And so it was a reminder that actually, like you said, things can get very non-linear when they have to. And that was heartening, actually, because there was something around, okay, that the sort of discontinuity can play in both directions, and even if it can feel sometimes like, oh my goodness, so what pathway are we on? Like there was almost like a hairpin turns are still possible in this world that we live in, but there is also something around, I think, the mutual aid that sort of and that sort of solidarity at the start of the pandemic was just a reminder that actually crisis can bring out the best in humans, and often do. And even though now, sort of many months on, and we're kind of like, and that has sort of like worn away a bit, that is still there in societies. And I think it was a good reminder that, like, that there's sort of like, we can get stuck in apocalyptic thinking, but actually when crises happen, it often does bring out the best of people and ingenuity, and people come together, and so that is, I think, part of it is almost like, we're heading for a world that is going to wake up very late actually to the reality of climate change, I think, but it will, at some point, it will wake up. But there's also something around, I think, again, the young as well, because they had a very difficult pandemic. People, I've got young sons who've they've sort of weathered it, but like, they've and the time has gone much slower for them. But there's something around, I think this is a generation that's sort of like, it's it's come through quite a defining moment, and it's probably been toughened by it to some extent, actually. And I do think that there is, I think people are going to be caught by surprise by what happens when that generation does start to move into more positions of power and does start to take decisions, because so much has been revealed to them already about how the world works, actually, and the system hasn't really taken account of them, and is showing no signs of doing so. I think they will be a very strong force to transform as they come of age. But even now, there's a lot, and I think, but also to not put the pressure on them to solve the problem, because they didn't create the problem. But it's almost like, how can we who are sort of in positions of power now do our really keep bringing in their perspective and their energy to what is happening.
Yeah. Okay, and so that brings us, I suppose, as we finish this conversation, to the power of individuals and the power of people, and to another aspect that's really shone much more brightly for me over the last 15 months is ultimately a lot of the deep transformation that we know is needed will come from how you view the world, your mindset. And I remember when we first started to talk about mindsets at Forum, 4 or 5 years ago, it did feel a bit California woo-woo, and I was thinking, really? Is that the deepest lever for change? And actually, of course it is. And if we believe that deep transformation is possible, then it's more likely to happen than if we don't believe it's possible. And we have tried to unpack what this means through our business transformation compass, and talk about a just and regenerative mindset. But for me, that is also a cause for some hope. So even if we find ourselves in unsettled, then we find ourselves in a reality that's got a heavy dose of compete and retreat and discipline in it as well. If we have a mindset that says, we can do this, and we think this is possible, then you can begin to work from the reality that you're in and start to chart a course to the reality that you want. And I suppose for me, then, don't ever underestimate the power of how you think about these things. It's just so important. Because I think Buckminster Fuller said, decades ago, we're called to be architects of our future, not victims of our past. And I think that's so true right now. And that is a source of some hope for me. But Joy, what gives you hope? Well, as someone that knows all these statistics inside out.
I don't know. I mean, to be honest, I think part of it is just having done pieces for so long and still being taken surprise by by what happens is that, like, it's never, the future isn't written, and this in the sort of non-linearity of sort of, like, even just the last sort of 10 years has been quite astonishing. If you think like 2011 between 2011 and now, extraordinary things have happened, not all of them positive, but there's a huge amount still that could happen. And there's that sort of rethink X future, which is interesting to think about as well, in terms of non-linearities there that could change things very quickly, probably very disruptively as well. But like, I think what gives me hope is the realization that very different futures are still possible, actually. Even they can feel like we're sort of trapped in an official future, and the most important thing is to sort of get out of that official future mindset. The future is almost never an extrapolation of today, basically. It never has been. And there's something interesting around, I think, with COP. There was a sort of, I think, I was reading a piece afterwards, reflecting on sort of like, was some things happened, nowhere near enough happened, but we might almost be at the point where sort of, someone was describing almost like a coalition of the willing starting to take form, starting to drive change, and actually being, what, we're going to just start implementing change. And and there's something about the power also of good examples. And I think particularly as it becomes clear, the other thing that's been really striking is how conversations about the economy and, like, should we go for degrowth and the rest of it. It's like, actually, look at what's happening. We're unlikely to get back towards a growth. We're running out of headroom. Like, that conversation about should we have it or not is not. We are getting it whether we like it or not. The question is, what sort of degrowth do we want? Do we want one that is redistributive? And there's a lot of wealth in the world still that can be put to very good use, that can be put to thriving and to adapting, mitigating. But there's something around, if we really pay attention to where we are now, there's so much we can do. And I think a lot of the problems that we're experiencing also stem from a slight denial of actually where we are right now, like the depth of the sort of, like, difficulty of the situation. Recognizing that also gives you what you need to sort of to burst through it, basically. And it does feel like that's kind of where we are now. We have to really face, actually, like, there's a huge number of barriers, but actually there's so much that we can do if we really are, if we really look at closely at where we are.
I love that. So if we're just really clear-eyed about this moment in time, then we can begin to make choices, take action that gets us to where we want to be. And that's still very, very possible. We just have to be realistic about where we are and feel empowered by that. As you say, there's no shortage of capital in this world. There's no shortage of will to do things differently. How then do we harness all of these ingredients of deep transformation and put them together in a way that drives the change that we want to change? And that's probably the moment to end this chat, because that's exactly what we want to see happen at Forum. We want to play a role in creating that deep transformation. And if you want to read more about the trajectories, if you want to get a bit deeper into where we think we are at the moment and where we might go next, what this might mean for government, for civil society, for business, then please keep an eye on our Future Centre. That's where we'll be publishing more about where next with the trajectories. But I think I would just leave you with a phrase that we use a lot in our futures workshops, but the future isn't something that's just going to happen to us. It's really something we can actively shape. And there's never been a better moment to grab hold of where we are at this moment in time and to shape the future that we want. Today is just a record of the decisions we made yesterday. So let's make the decisions we make today really create that framework that we want for tomorrow. It's entirely possible. It might not be easy, but it's possible. So thank you, Joy, for your time. We appreciate it, and we'll leave it here.
Great, thank you.